Hello, this is Joseph Holbrook. Give me 1 second while I get my stuff going here. This is Joseph Holbrook, and I'm coming to you with part 2 of the series that I'm doing on U.S. Latin American relations. So let's begin. Today, what I want to talk about is the Mexican-American War, which happened in 1846. And I must apologize, I made an error in the last video when I said something about President Knox. I'm sure there is an important Knox in history because there's Knoxville and Fort Knox, but it was not President Knox. I don't think there was a President Knox. It was President Polk that I was talking about. So, the Mexican-American War in 1846. Let's begin. All right, we'll get it going here in a moment. We started halfway through the Prezi. Let's try this, backing it up. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. So this is actually you might consider the beginning of U.S. imperialism in 1846, although it takes a huge leap forward in the 1890s and the turn of the century in 1900 with the Spanish-American War, but we will get to that later. Thomas Jefferson said in the 1780s, in due time, the U.S. would take over Latin America piece by piece. Chillingly prescient. So pocketbook diplomacy was what this period of time is called, where the U.S. was able to use actually fairly economic resources and purchase expansion. In 1803, under Jefferson, the United States purchased Louisiana from Napoleon. Louisiana was not just the current state of Louisiana, but a territory all the way up to Mississippi and into Canada. That was the Louisiana Purchase. It was a huge expansion of the United States, and it also removed the French from being the buffer between the Spanish and the Americans, as I mentioned in the last section. Also in 1817, the United States obtained Florida from Spain under Andrew Jackson. In 1820, this won't move. In 1820, Jefferson wrote Monroe about the desirability of acquiring Texas for the expansion of the United States. This was 1820, a good bit, 26 years before the Mexican-American War. 1823, Monroe was considering acquiring both Texas and Cuba after recognizing the new Latin American republics that had just won their independence from Spain. And what we'll find as we go through this is there was quite a bit. Oh, why did it do that again? It keeps jumping to the middle of the presentation. Hold on. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, I think we're there. Okay, so slavery, race, and Mexico. There was an all-Mexico movement that advocated annexing the whole country of Mexico into the United States. However, there was as you might imagine, in the early part of the 19th century, political correctness was certainly not around, and racism was rampant among many, if not most people in our society, most white people. And so there's quite a bit of text that one can read from that time period that are blatantly racist against blacks, against the Mexicans. So there was a concern if the United States annexed the entire country of Mexico, what would that do to our Anglo-Saxon population? Because it would give one concern was that owning Mexico would give blacks a route south towards the tropics instead of encouraging them to move north into the northern cities. Other northern abolitionists and many slave owners opposed attempting to incorporate 8 million Mexicans into the national political body for racial, religious, and ethnic reasons. A consensus was achieved that the only land taken from Mexico should be as devoid of Mexicans as possible. So, if you feel that there's a lot of bigoted and ethnocentric rhetoric going on right now against immigrants from the South, particularly against Mexicans, realize that it's not new. It's been around for a while. And so the first goal was Texas. Mexicans could actually see it coming. The United States negotiated to acquire Mexican territory in 1825. Andrew Jackson began an 8-year effort to acquire land in Texas in the mid 19. I'm sorry, that is supposed to read 1829. I'll have to correct that later. In mid 1829, Mexico also emancipated its slaves in 1829, partly to discourage immigration to Texas, because most of the U.S. citizens who wanted to immigrate to Texas were slave owners who were attempting to expand the ideology of chattel slavery. In 1836, Santa Anna invaded Texas. Actually, not invaded. That was a big slip. And Santa Anna went into Texas with a Mexican army to defend Mexican sovereign rights against the Alamo and Sam Houston. The negotiator, Poinsett, referred to the Mexicans as an ignorant and immoral race, and to the clergy as the very dregs of the people, disgustingly debauched and ignorant. He criticized the tendency of Creole Mexicans to engage in a constant intercourse with the Aborigines, who were still and are degraded to the very lowest class of human beings. I don't think you could make a more ugly statement if you tried. So do you remember last week I talked about my Clint Eastwood theory of history? Here we're looking at a bit of the ugly side of United States history. And there'll be more to come. Manifest Destiny was an ideology, a claim that the United States had a destiny to overspread and possess the whole of the continent, the North American continent, which Providence has given us for the development of a great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. John L. O'Sullivan wrote those words in 1845 in the New York Morning News. And that was the beginning of the concept or ideology of manifest destiny. In 1845, expansionist James K. Polk rose to the presidency and annexed Texas into the Union. In the following year, Polk dispatched General Zachery Taylor to the Texas-Mexican border to provoke a fight with Mexico. Polk attacked Mexico while rebels in California succeeded from Mexico. It was a coordinated plan. Winfield Scott led an army from Veracruz to Mexico City. This is a picture of President Polk. This was considered by many to be an unjust war. Prominent Americans such as Henry David Thoreau opposed the war and called it unjust. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded vast areas of Mexico from Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. California, Utah, and Colorado were also included as possessions that were ceded to the United States. More than 1 million square miles for only $15 million. One of my childhood heroes was Henry David Thoreau, Walden's Pond, and Civil Disobedience, which I read in high school. The aftermath of the war was that the supporters of the All Mexico idea were hopelessly outnumbered. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo arrived in Washington. President Polk knew that the public had gotten tired of the war. 1846, there was an agreement with Great Britain to split the Oregon Territory at the 49th parallel. So the debates over all Mexico on basically centered around slavery and race. Abraham Lincoln condemned the Mexican War as unnecessary and unconstitutional. There were disagreements over slavery, of course, severe disagreements, and the expansion into Mexico split the Democratic Party into North and South, and it brought a complete end to the Whig Party. The conflict with Mexico accelerated the disintegration of the Union. Years later, U.S. Grant would write in his memoirs that the Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions, said Ulysses S. Grant. A number of Civil War generals served in the Mexican-American War. A few of them are listed here. Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson for the South were all officers in the Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, and George McClellan. There's a link that you can find out some more about Civil War generals who fought in the Mexican-American War. So this was the first big incursion of the United States into Latin America. During the Civil War, there was a war between Mexico and France called the Franco-Mexican War. Began in 1861 and lasted until 1867. Mexican conservatives had lost a civil war with the liberals in Mexico, and they were afraid that Mexico would not be able to protect itself from further encroachments of the U.S. without European help, and they began to look to France. Spain was it was very obvious that Spain was growing weakened at this time, and so Latin America, I should say Spanish America, which had looked to Spain for Catholic values and heritage, Hispanic heritage and tradition, and monarchy, now begin to look to France as a model or as a source. And so this encouraged the process of using the word Latin America to define Spanish and Portuguese America as opposed to Spanish America, Brazil. The French-speaking islands could be included from some points of view into Latin America. And so Latin America was kind of a political invention to some degree to strengthen non-Anglo America, or America south of the border with Mexico and the United States. I've talked about this before in other videos. The idea that the entire hemisphere is America, and that our country, although we call ourselves Americans, actually in Spanish we could call ourselves Estadounidenses. The word doesn't exist in English. It would be United Statesians. Americans are everyone, historically, Americans are everyone from the southern tip of Argentina to the northern part of Canada. But somehow we appropriated that term for ourselves and called the rest of them Latin Americans. Conservatives invited France to send a monarch to rule Mexico. It also directly led to the emergence of the concept of Latin America. The Frenchman who came was a Austrian Archduke named Maximiliano, or Maximilian, who actually, even though he was invited by conservatives himself, he was pretty liberal. He believed in constitutional monarchy, checks and balances, human rights, but he failed. Once the Civil War ended, Napoleon III withdrew his troops and left Maximilian to be apprehended and executed. This is Benito Juarez, who was a full-blooded Zapotec Indian who was managed to receive an education, rose to become a Mexican lawyer, rose up through the ranks, and eventually became the president of Mexico. And he was the inspiration and leader of the liberals in their fight against the conservatives, in their anti-clerical attempts to curb the power of the Catholic Church, the political power at least. And also he led the fight against the French. He is an inspirational figure to Mexicans. And that concludes our discussion of the Mexican-American War. I will continue this lesson with a discussion about the background in Cuba and the desire in the United States from early in the 19th century to acquire Cuba as a territory or even as a slave state for the United States. Thank you very much for your time and attention.